The wind swept across the empty Nebraska plains, carrying dust through the cracks of Thomas Mitchell's small wooden cabin. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the newspaper advertisement he had written and rewritten a dozen times. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to mock his loneliness. Thomas was 28 years old, but he felt much older. 3 years had passed since his mother died of fever, leaving him completely alone on their 160-acre homestead. The nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away, and the small town of Cedar Falls was a hard day's ride on horseback. Days would go by without Thomas hearing another human voice except his own. He had tried everything to meet a suitable wife. He attended every church social, every barn raising, and every town gathering. But Cedar Falls was a small place, and most of the young women had already married or moved away to bigger cities. The few unmarried ladies showed no interest in a quiet farmer who smelled of hay and had dirt under his fingernails. His mother had always told him that someday he would find a good woman to share his life. She had painted pictures with her words of cozy evenings by the fire, children playing in the yard, and the warm comfort of a loving partnership. Now, sitting alone in the cabin where those dreams had been born, Thomas felt the weight of unfulfilled promises, the idea of a mail order. Bride had seemed desperate at first, but as winter melted into spring and spring bloomed into summer, his desperation grew stronger than his pride. He had heard stories of successful matches made through matrimonial agencies back east. Men in California and Oregon had found loving wives this way. Why not Nebraska? Thomas pulled out his best writing paper and began crafting his advertisement. He described his farm honestly, the good soil, the sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands, the creek that ran clear and cold even in the hottest summers. He mentioned his age, his steady income from wheat and corn, and his hope for a family. He did not mention the crushing loneliness that made him talk to his horses just to hear conversation. The letter found its way to the Hartwell Matrimonial Agency in Boston, Massachusetts. Within 3 weeks, Thomas received his first response. The envelope was addressed in the most beautiful handwriting he had ever seen, with elegant curves and perfect spacing. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with delicate features and kind eyes, along with a letter that made his heart race. Eleanor Hartwell described herself as 24 years old, well-educated and experienced in all the domestic arts that would make a good wife. She wrote about her love of reading, her skill at the piano, and her dream of building a peaceful life away from the noise and crowds of the city. Her letters were like poetry, filled with gentle observations about nature and quiet hopes for the future. Thomas found himself rushing to the post office every few days, eager for her next letter. Eleanor wrote about her small garden where she grew herbs and flowers. She described the books she read and the songs she played. She asked thoughtful questions about his farm, his daily routines, and his dreams for their future together. As autumn approached, their correspondence grew more frequent and more personal. Eleanor confessed that she had been orphaned young and worked as a companion to an elderly lady. She had little money but much love to give. Thomas shared stories of his childhood on the farm, his struggles after his mother's death, and his growing excitement about their future together. When Eleanor agreed to marry him, Thomas felt as though the sun had broken through storm clouds. He sent her every dollar he had saved over the past 5 years, enough money for train passage from Boston to Nebraska, with a little extra for a new dress and traveling necessities. The amount represented months of careful saving, skipping meals, and mending clothes instead of buying new ones. Thomas threw himself into preparing for her arrival. He spent his evenings after farm work repairing and improving every corner of his cabin. He built new shelves for her books, installed better windows to let in more light, and even attempted to construct a small piano bench in hopes of someday buying her an instrument. He practiced conversations in the cracked mirror above his wash basin, rehearsing how he would greet her at the stagecoach depot. He imagined walking through town with his refined, educated wife on his arm, finally belonging to the community of married couples instead of standing alone at the edges of social gatherings. The whole town of Cedar Falls knew about Thomas's coming bride. The postmaster commented on the frequent letters from Boston. The general store owner helped him select fabric for new curtains. Even the pastor offered advice about marriage and spoke of performing the ceremony once Eleanor arrived and they had time to get properly acquainted. Thomas counted the days like a schoolboy waiting for Christmas. He had never felt such anticipation, such hope for the future. Eleanor represented everything he had dreamed of: education, refinement, gentle companionship, and the promise of children who would inherit not just his farm but also her cultured intelligence. The last letter from Eleanor arrived on a crisp October morning. She wrote that she would arrive on the Tuesday afternoon stagecoach, wearing a blue traveling dress so he would recognize her. Thomas read the letter so many times that the paper grew soft from handling. He bought his first store-bought suit from the general store, spending money he could barely afford on black wool and a white shirt that felt strange against his work-roughened skin. As the day of her arrival approached, Thomas could barely concentrate on his daily chores. His neighbors noticed his distracted air and wished him luck with good-natured teasing. The widow who lived closest to his farm even baked an extra pie for him to take home, joking that his bride would need sustenance after her long journey. That Tuesday morning, Thomas bathed in the creek despite the cold water, put on his new suit, and rode into town 2 hours early. He sat on the bench outside the depot, clutching a bouquet of the last autumn flowers he could find, watching every dust cloud on the horizon for sign of the approaching stagecoach. His hands shook slightly as he thought about finally meeting the woman whose letters had filled his lonely evenings with hope. Eleanor Hartwell was coming to Cedar Falls, coming to be his wife, coming to transform his quiet farm into a real home. Thomas had never wanted anything more in his entire life. Thomas woke up every morning with Eleanor's arrival date circled in red on his calendar. 3 weeks to go, then 2, then 1. Each day brought a mixture of excitement and nervous energy that made it hard to focus on his usual farm work. His horses probably thought he had lost his mind. The way he would suddenly stop in the middle of feeding them to rush back to the cabin and rearrange the furniture one more time. The cabin had never looked so good. Thomas spent every spare moment scrubbing, building, and fixing things that had been broken for months. He repaired the loose floorboard that creaked by the door, patched the small hole in the roof that leaked during heavy rains, and even whitewashed the walls inside to make everything look fresh and clean. He built Eleanor a proper dressing table from pine lumber, complete with a small mirror he bought from the general store. The mirror cost him a week's worth of eggs, but he imagined her sitting there each morning, brushing her hair and getting ready for their days together. He made shelves for her books, picturing them filled with the leather-bound volumes she had mentioned in her letters. The most challenging project was installing glass windows. Thomas had always made do with wooden shutters that kept out the cold but also blocked the light. Eleanor had written about loving sunshine and fresh air, so he decided she needed real windows. The glass had to be ordered from back east and cost more money than he usually spent in 3 months, but he told himself it was an investment in their happiness. Installing the windows himself proved more difficult than he had expected. The first pane cracked when he tried to fit it into the frame. The second one went in crooked and had to be removed and reset by the time he got both windows properly installed. He had cuts on his hands and a new respect for professional carpenters, but the cabin was transformed. Sunlight streamed in like golden honey, making everything warm and welcoming. Thomas also tackled the cooking situation. He had survived for 3 years on burned bacon, lumpy porridge, and whatever vegetables he could manage not to ruin. Eleanor deserved better. He convinced the pastor's wife to give him cooking lessons, claiming he wanted to surprise his bride with a good meal on their first day together. The cooking lessons were humbling. Thomas learned that he had been doing almost everything wrong. You were supposed to let bread rise twice, not just once. Vegetables needed to be cut evenly so they cooked at the same rate. Meat should be seasoned before cooking, not after. The pastor's wife was patient but firm, making him practice the same simple recipes until he could prepare them without burning anything. Meanwhile, the whole town of Cedar Falls was following Thomas's preparations with friendly interest. The blacksmith offered to shoe his horse for free so Thomas could make a good impression when he drove Eleanor around town. The schoolteacher, one of the few educated women in the area, volunteered to help Thomas write better letters, though she privately wondered what kind of refined Boston lady would want to live on an isolated Nebraska farm. The general store became Thomas's second home as he shopped for things he had never needed before. He bought real tea instead of the bitter coffee he usually drank, thinking Eleanor might prefer something more delicate. He purchased fabric too. Make proper curtains for his new windows, though he had to ask for help measuring and cutting it correctly. Most expensive of all was the dress he ordered for Eleanor. He wanted her to have something beautiful to wear for their wedding, something that showed how much he valued her. The dressmaker in town agreed to make a wedding dress based on Eleanor's. Measurements from her letters, working from a pattern in a ladies' magazine. The dress was simple but elegant, made from cream-colored silk that cost Thomas nearly a month's earnings. His neighbor, a practical widow named Rebecca, who ran a small farm by herself, often stopped by to check on his progress. She helped him hang the curtains properly and taught him how to arrange furniture so the cabin would feel spacious instead of cramped. Rebecca seemed amused by Thomas's efforts but also somewhat concerned. "You sure are putting a lot of hope on this girl," she said one evening as she helped him move his table to get better light from the new windows. "What if she's not exactly what you're expecting?" Thomas paused in his work, considering the question. "She has to be what I'm expecting," he said finally. "I've got nothing else to hope for." Rebecca studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the loneliness that had driven him to this desperate arrangement. She wanted to warn him that people were not always what they seemed in letters, that disappointment was possible, but she could see how much joy the preparation was bringing him. Instead, she just nodded and helped him finish moving the furniture. The town barber gave Thomas his first professional haircut in years, trimming his shaggy brown hair and showing him how to use pomade to keep it neat. Thomas practiced tying his new necktie in front of his small mirror, fumbling with the unfamiliar knot until he could manage it smoothly. He even attempted to learn some social graces by watching other couples at church gatherings. He observed how educated men helped their wives with their coats, how they offered their arms when walking, how they spoke politely to other ladies. Thomas felt clumsy and awkward trying to copy these behaviors, but he was determined to be the kind of husband Eleanor deserved. The final week before her arrival was almost unbearable. Thomas checked and rechecked everything in the cabin. He practiced his greeting speech in front of the mirror until the words sounded natural. He planned their first week together, imagining long conversations by the fire, walks around the farm so he could show her everything, and quiet evenings reading together. He wrote Eleanor one last letter, telling her how excited he was and describing all the improvements he had made to welcome her. He mailed it knowing she would probably receive it after she had already left Boston, but he wanted her to know how much thought and care he had put into preparing for their life together. The Sunday before her Tuesday arrival, Thomas sat in church, trying to concentrate on the pastor's sermon about faith and patience. But his mind kept wandering to Eleanor, wondering what she was doing at that very moment. Was she packing her trunk? Was she nervous about meeting him? Was she as excited as he was about starting their new life together? As he walked home from church that afternoon, Thomas looked at his farm with fresh eyes. The cabin looked cozy and welcoming with its new windows gleaming in the sunlight. His fields were cleared and ready for spring planting. His barn was sturdy and well maintained. For the first time in years, he felt proud of what he had built instead of ashamed of its simplicity. Monday night, Thomas barely slept. He lay in his bed looking up at the ceiling, thinking about how this would be his last night alone in the cabin. Tomorrow evening, Eleanor would be here. They would eat dinner together at his newly repaired table. They would sit by the fire and get to know each other beyond their letters. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years would finally come to an end. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cloudy, but Thomas's spirits were bright as sunshine. He put on his new suit, pinned a wildflower to his lapel, and set out for town with a bouquet of autumn flowers and a heart full of dreams about to come true. The stagecoach appeared on the horizon at exactly 2 o'clock, just as the driver had promised. Thomas stood up from the depot bench, smoothing down his new suit jacket and checking his necktie one final time. His heart was beating so fast he wondered if the other people waiting could hear it. He clutched the bouquet of flowers in his sweaty palms, trying to remember the greeting speech he had practiced 100 times. The coach rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust, and Thomas stepped forward with a nervous smile. He had studied Eleanor's photograph so many times that he could picture her delicate features perfectly. He expected to see a petite woman in a blue traveling dress, just as she had described in her final letter. Instead, the coach door swung open, and the biggest woman Thomas had ever seen climbed down onto the dusty ground. She was nearly 6 feet tall and built like a farm worker, with broad shoulders and strong arms that strained against her plain brown dress. Her red hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her face was flushed from the long journey. She looked around the small depot with sharp green eyes, taking in the handful of wooden buildings that made up Cedar Falls. Thomas stood frozen, flowers forgotten in his hand. This could not be Eleanor. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe Eleanor was still inside the coach. Maybe this woman was just another passenger who happened to get off at the same stop. But the woman walked straight toward him with confident steps that shook the wooden platform. "You must be Thomas Mitchell," she said in a voice with a thick Irish accent. "I'm Bertha May Sullivan. I'm here to be your wife." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He stared at her in complete shock, unable to speak. Behind him, he could hear whispers from the other people at the depot. Someone laughed, though they tried to cover it with a cough. Thomas felt his face burning with embarrassment. "There's been some mistake," he finally managed to say. "I was expecting Eleanor Hartwell. We've been writing letters for months." "Bertha." May's expression softened slightly. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Thomas recognized his own handwriting on the envelopes. "Eleanor Hartwell was my employer," Bertha May explained, her voice gentler now. "I worked as her cook and housekeeper for 2 years. She was a lovely lady, truly she was. But she took sick with the lung fever 6 weeks ago and passed away quietly in her sleep." Thomas felt the world spinning around him. "Passed away? But her letters ... we were planning." "She asked me to write the letters for her," Bertha May continued. "Her hands shook too much from the fever, and she didn't want you to worry. She told me what to say about her love of books and music and such. Eleanor really did want to come here and be your wife. She talked about it constantly, even when she was very sick." The small crowd that had gathered to watch the coach arrival was now openly staring at the strange scene. Thomas could feel their curious eyes on him, could imagine the stories they would tell their families that evening. The successful businessman who had come to pick up a shipment looked amused. The pastor's wife appeared concerned. The town gossips were practically glowing with excitement at this unexpected drama. "But why are you here?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bertha May straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. "Because Eleanor made me promise to honor the arrangement if anything happened to her. She said you seemed like a good man from your letters, and she couldn't bear the thought of you losing your money and getting nothing in return. And because ... She paused, looking down at her worn boots. "Because I had nowhere else to go." She explained that Eleanor had been her only family after she came to America from Ireland. When Eleanor died, her relatives had sold the house and everything in it. Bertha May had found herself on the street with nothing but her clothes and the small amount of money Eleanor had left her, which was barely enough for the train ticket to Nebraska. "I know I'm not what you expected," Bertha May said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not educated or refined like Eleanor was. I can't play piano or speak French or any of those fancy things. But I can work hard, and I can be loyal, and I can help you run this farm better than any delicate city lady ever could." Thomas looked at this large, practical woman standing in front of him and felt his carefully planned future crumbling like a house of cards. This was not the gentle, educated wife he had dreamed of. This was not the refined companion who would bring culture and sophistication to his simple life. This was a working woman with calloused hands and a direct manner that was nothing like Eleanor's poetic letters. "I can't," he said finally. "This isn't what we agreed to. I'm sorry about Eleanor, truly I am, but I can't marry someone I don't know. Someone who's nothing like what I expected." Bertha May nodded as if she had expected this response. "I understand," she said calmly. "I wouldn't want to marry a stranger either, but I've got nowhere to go and no money to get there. Could you maybe let me work for you for a while?" "I could." "Earn enough to pay you back for the train ticket and then move on to somewhere else." Thomas felt trapped. He couldn't just abandon this woman in the middle of Nebraska with no money and no place to go. But he also couldn't imagine taking her home to his carefully prepared cabin, couldn't picture introducing her to his neighbors as his intended wife. The stagecoach driver was getting impatient, muttering about schedules and wanting to leave for the next town. Other passengers were boarding, and the small drama at Cedar Falls Depot was holding up their journey. "Please," Bertha May said quietly, "just give me a chance to prove I'm worth something. I won't be any trouble, and I'll work harder than any hired hand you could find. I've got nowhere else to turn." Thomas looked around at the watching faces, at the coach driver tapping his foot, at this strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere to turn his life upside down. He thought about his empty cabin with its new windows and carefully arranged furniture, about the wedding dress hanging in his closet, about all his dreams of refined companionship and educated conversation, but he also thought about Bertha May, standing alone on the platform with her small bag and nowhere to go. Despite his shock and disappointment, he couldn't bring himself to abandon someone who was clearly in desperate need of help. "All right," he said finally, his voice tight with reluctance. "You can come to the farm for now. We'll figure out what to do after that." Bertha May's face broke into a smile that transformed her entire appearance. "Thank you," she said simply. "You won't regret this, I promise." But as Thomas helped her load her single trunk into his wagon and drove out of town with this unexpected stranger beside him, he wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. The whispers and stares of the townspeople followed them all the way to the edge of Cedar Falls, and Thomas knew that by evening, everyone in the county would know that Thomas Mitchell's delicate mail-order bride had turned out to be something else entirely. The ride to his farm passed in uncomfortable silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts about this strange turn of fate that had brought them together. The wagon ride to Thomas's farm felt like the longest 2 hours of his life. Bertha May sat beside him on the narrow bench, her large frame taking up more space than he was used to sharing. Every bump in the dirt road reminded him of how different this moment was from what he had imagined. He had pictured making gentle conversation with Eleanor about the passing scenery, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about his childhood on these same roads. Instead, they rode mostly in silence. Thomas didn't know what to say to this stranger who had appended all his carefully laid plans. Bertha May seemed content to look around at the rolling prairie grassland, occasionally commenting on the quality of the soil or the health of someone else's cattle. Her observations were practical and knowledgeable, nothing like the poetic appreciation of nature he had expected from Eleanor's letters. When they finally reached his property, Thomas felt a stab of embarrassment as he saw his farm through Bertha May's eyes. The cabin that had seemed so cozy and welcoming that morning now looked small and modest. His carefully tended garden appeared humble next to the vast emptiness of the prairie. Even his prized new windows seemed to mock him, reflecting the gray afternoon sky like disappointed eyes. "Nice place," Bertha May said as she climbed down from the wagon. "Good water source, I see. That creek will be handy for washing and watering livestock. Your soil looks rich, too. You've done well for yourself out here." Her matter-of-fact approval should have pleased Thomas, but instead it made him feel even more confused. This wasn't how he had imagined showing his home to his bride. There should have been romantic excitement, shy glances, and gentle compliments about the improvements he had made for her comfort. Thomas helped Bertha May carry her trunk into the cabin, and immediately regretted all the time he had spent preparing the space. The delicate touches he had added for Eleanor seemed ridiculous now. The small dressing table looked like doll furniture next to Bertha May's substantial frame. The carefully arranged books and feminine decorations appeared silly and presumptuous. "Oh, my," Bertha May said as she looked around the cabin interior. "You certainly did go to a lot of trouble fixing this place up. Those windows are beautiful, and this furniture is all handmade, isn't it? You're quite the craftsman." Again, her genuine appreciation made Thomas feel worse instead of better. He had put his heart into preparing this space for a woman who would never come, and now he felt foolish for all his romantic dreams. "Where would you like me to put my things?" Bertha May asked practically. "I don't want to assume anything about sleeping arrangements, given the circumstances." Thomas felt his face grow hot. He hadn't thought about the practical details of housing an unexpected guest. His cabin only had one bedroom, and he certainly couldn't ask Bertha May to sleep outside. But he also couldn't imagine sharing his bed with this virtual stranger. "You can have the bedroom," he said awkwardly. "I'll sleep on the floor by the fireplace." "That's not necessary," Bertha May replied. "I'm used to sleeping anywhere." "You shouldn't give up your own bed for someone who just showed up uninvited." They argued politely about the sleeping arrangements for several minutes before Bertha May finally agreed to take the bedroom, but only if Thomas would let her pay him back with work around the farm. She insisted on starting immediately, despite having just completed a long and tiring journey. Thomas watched in amazement as Bertha May rolled up her sleeves and began examining his kitchen with a critical eye. She opened cupboards, checked his food supplies, and made disapproving noises at what she found. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" she asked, holding up a piece of bacon that had seen better days. "I eat fine," Thomas said defensively. "I can cook basic things." Bertha May raised an eyebrow and continued her inspection. She found his attempts at bread making, his burnt attempts at vegetables, and his collection of mostly empty food containers. Her expression grew more concerned with each discovery. "You're half-starved," she announced. "No wonder you look so thin. A man can't work a farm properly without decent food in his belly." Before Thomas could protest, Bertha May had taken over his kitchen completely. She sent him outside to bring in firewood and fetch water from the creek while she began preparing what she called a real dinner. Thomas found himself following her orders without quite understanding how she had taken charge so quickly from outside. He could hear her moving around the cabin with confident efficiency. Pots and pans clanged, cupboard doors opened and closed, and Bertha May hummed tunelessly as she worked. The sounds were foreign in his usually quiet home, and Thomas wasn't sure if he found them comforting or intrusive when he returned with the water. The cabin smelled better than it had in years. Bertha May had somehow transformed his meager food supplies into what looked like a feast. Fresh bread was rising by the fire, vegetables were cooking in a pot that actually smelled appetizing, and she had managed to turn his questionable bacon into something that looked edible. "How did you do all this?" Thomas asked, genuinely amazed. "Practice," Bertha May said simply. "I've been cooking for other people since I was 12 years old. It's just a matter of knowing what goes with what and paying attention to what you're doing." They sat down to dinner at Thomas's carefully repaired table, and he had to admit that Bertha May's cooking was the best meal he had eaten since his mother died. The bread was soft and warm, the vegetables were perfectly seasoned, and even the bacon tasted better than anything he had managed to prepare, but the conversation was stilted and awkward. Thomas kept thinking about the romantic dinners he had imagined sharing with Eleanor, full of literary discussion and gentle getting-to-know-you questions. Instead, Bertha May talked about practical things like crop rotation, livestock management, and the best methods for preserving food through the winter. "You're planning to plant wheat again next spring?" she asked between bites. "Yes, it's been my most reliable crop," Thomas replied. "Have you considered diversifying? Maybe some corn or potatoes? Putting all your hopes on one crop is risky if the weather doesn't cooperate." Thomas found himself drawn into a discussion about farming techniques, surprised by Bertha May's knowledge and practical suggestions. She had clearly worked on farms before and understood the challenges of making a living from the land. But this wasn't the kind of conversation he had dreamed of having with his wife. After dinner, Bertha May insisted on cleaning up while Thomas sat awkwardly by the fire. He usually spent his evenings reading or planning the next day's work, but tonight he felt like a stranger in his own home. Everything was the same, but everything was different. "You don't have to do all the work," Thomas said as Bertha May scrubbed his dishes with more thoroughness than they had seen in months. "I told you I'd earn my keep," she replied. "Besides, I can't stand a messy kitchen. It makes me nervous." When the dishes were done, they sat by the fire in uncomfortable silence. Thomas had planned to spend this evening getting to know Eleanor, hearing about her journey, and beginning to build the foundation of their future together. Instead, he found himself sneaking glances at this large, practical woman who seemed perfectly comfortable in his space while he felt completely out of place. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Bertha May said finally, staring into the flames. "I know you were expecting someone different, someone better suited to your dreams. But I want you to know that Eleanor really did care about you. She talked about your letters all the time, about how kind and honest you seemed. She was truly excited about coming here." Thomas felt a pang of grief for the woman he had never met, but had grown to love through letters. What was she like? Really like? Bertha May smiled sadly. She was everything you thought she was from her letters. Gentle, educated, well-mannered. She could play piano beautifully and knew more about books than anyone I ever met. She would have made you a good wife in her way. And you? Thomas asked. Immediately regretting the blunt question, Bertha May was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not gentle or educated or well-mannered. I'm just someone who knows how to work hard and survive. I won't pretend to be something I'm not." As the fire burned lower, they both realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Thomas would have to figure out what to tell his neighbors, how to explain Bertha May's presence, and what their arrangement really meant. Bertha May would have to prove herself worthy of the chance Thomas had given her, knowing that she was nothing like what he had wanted. Neither of them slept well that first night, both wondering what they had gotten themselves into, and whether this strange twist of fate would lead to something workable or simply postpone an inevitable disappointment. Thomas woke up to the sound of someone moving around his kitchen before dawn. For a confused moment, he thought he was dreaming, but then he remembered the events of the previous day. Bertha May was already up, and from the sounds and smells coming from the kitchen area, she was preparing breakfast. He dressed quickly and found her standing over the stove, cooking what looked like more food than he usually ate in 2 days. Eggs, bacon, fresh biscuits, and even some kind of fried potatoes filled his small kitchen with amazing aromas. "You don't have to cook for me," Thomas said, still feeling awkward about the whole situation. "A working man needs a proper breakfast," Bertha May replied without turning around. "Besides, I'm used to getting up early. I like the quiet of the morning." Thomas had to admit that the breakfast was incredible. Everything was cooked perfectly, seasoned just right, and served hot. He found himself eating more than he had in weeks, feeling actually satisfied for the first time in months. "I thought I might take a look around your farm today," Bertha May said as they ate. "See what kind of work needs doing. If I'm going to earn my keep, I should know what I'm working with." After breakfast, Thomas showed her around his property, pointing out his fields, his barn, and his small collection of livestock. He expected her to make polite comments like Eleanor might have, but instead, Bertha May examined everything with the eye of someone who really understood farming. "Your plow needs work," she said, running her hands over the metal blade. "This nick here is making it pull to one side. No wonder your furrows are uneven." Thomas looked at the plow, which had been giving him trouble for months. He had planned to take it to the blacksmith in town when he had enough money, but he couldn't afford the repair right now. "I can fix that," Bertha May said casually. "I learned smithing work from my father back in Ireland." He said a farmer who couldn't maintain his own tools was at the mercy of everyone else. Thomas stared at her. "You know blacksmith work?" "Enough to handle basic repairs," she said. "It's not complicated, just requires the right tools and some patience." Over the next few hours, Thomas watched in amazement as Bertha May set up a makeshift forge using his fireplace and some old iron pieces she found in his barn. She heated the plow blade until it glowed red, then hammered out the nick with strong, confident strokes. When she was finished, the plow looked better than it had when Thomas first bought it. "How did you learn to do that?" he asked. "Necessity," Bertha May replied, wiping sweat from her forehead. "When you're poor, you learn to fix things yourself or do without. I've fixed everything from wagon wheels to roof leaks." As the days passed, Thomas discovered that Bertha May had an incredible range of practical skills. She could mend harnesses with stitches so neat they looked professional. She knew which wild plants could be eaten and which ones were good for medicine. She could judge the weather by watching cloud formations and feeling changes in the wind. When 3 of his chickens got sick, Thomas was ready to accept the loss. Chickens died sometimes, and there wasn't much a farmer could do about it. But Bertha May took one look at the birds and immediately began mixing up some kind of herbal remedy. "They've got the gapeworm," she said confidently. "I've seen it before. This mixture should clear it up in a few days." Thomas was skeptical, but sure enough, the chickens recovered completely. Bertha May seemed to have an instinctive understanding of animal health that impressed even the local veterinarian when he stopped by to check on a horse. "Where did you learn so much about livestock?" Thomas asked one evening after she had successfully helped one of his cows through a difficult birthing. "Same place I learned everything else," Bertha May said. "Working on other people's farms, watching what worked and what didn't. When you move around as much as I have, you pick up all kinds of knowledge." But Thomas's biggest surprise came when an early winter storm hit harder than anyone had expected. The wind was fierce enough to damage buildings, and the temperature dropped so fast that Thomas worried about losing his entire herd of cattle. While Thomas was still trying to figure out what to do, Bertha May was already taking action. She organized a system for moving the cattle to better shelter, using her knowledge of animal behavior to guide them safely through the storm. She showed Thomas how to use hay and blankets to create windbreaks, and she worked alongside him for 16 straight hours to make sure every animal was protected. When the storm finally passed, Thomas realized that without Bertha May's quick thinking and hard work, he would have lost at least half his livestock. The financial disaster that could have ruined him had been prevented by this woman he had barely known a week ago. "I don't know how to thank you," Thomas said as they stood in his barn, exhausted but victorious, surrounded by healthy animals. "No need for thanks," Bertha May replied. "This is what partners do for each other." The word partners hung in the air between them, and Thomas realized that something had shifted during the storm. He had stopped thinking of Bertha May as an unwelcome stranger and started seeing her as someone genuinely valuable to his farm and his life. But even as he began to appreciate her practical skills, Thomas still struggled with his disappointment about Eleanor. He found himself comparing everything Bertha May did to what he imagined Eleanor would have done. When Bertha May hummed while she worked, he thought about Eleanor's piano playing. When Bertha May made straightforward conversation about crops and weather, he remembered Eleanor's poetic letters about literature and music. The problem was that Thomas was beginning to realize that Eleanor's refined qualities, while lovely in letters, might not have been very helpful in the harsh reality of frontier life. Bertha May could save his livestock, repair his equipment, and keep him fed and healthy. What could Eleanor have contributed beyond pleasant conversation? This thought made Thomas feel guilty, as if he was betraying Eleanor's memory by appreciating the woman who had taken her place. He was caught between mourning the gentle, educated wife he had lost and being grateful for the capable, practical woman who had appeared in her place. Bertha May seemed to sense his internal struggle. Though she never mentioned it directly, she worked hard every day to prove her worth, taking on tasks that would have challenged most hired hands. She never complained about the rough living conditions or asked for anything beyond basic necessities. But Thomas noticed that sometimes, in quiet moments, Bertha May looked sad and a little lost. He realized that this arrangement was just as difficult for her as it was for him. She was trying to build a life in a place where she wasn't really wanted, with a man who was clearly disappointed that she wasn't someone else. As October turned into November, They settled into an efficient routine. Bertha May handled most of the domestic work and helped with farm tasks that required her specialized knowledge. Thomas managed the field work and the financial aspects of running the farm. They worked well together, but there was still an emotional distance between them. Thomas knew that he needed to make a decision about their future. He couldn't keep Bertha May around indefinitely without some kind of commitment, and she deserved to know whether she was building toward something permanent or just postponing an inevitable goodbye. The question was whether a marriage based on practical partnership could ever grow into something more meaningful, or whether Thomas would always be haunted by dreams of what might have been with Eleanor. November brought the busy season of preparing for winter, and Thomas found himself working alongside Bertha May with increasing comfort and efficiency. They had developed an easy rhythm of shared tasks and complementary skills that made the farm run smoother than it ever had when Thomas worked alone. Bertha May had taken over the kitchen garden completely, transforming it into something that would have made Thomas's mother proud. She knew exactly which vegetables could be stored through winter and how to preserve them properly. Under her care, his root cellar filled with potatoes, turnips, and carrots that would keep them fed until spring. She dried herbs, canned vegetables, and even made preserves from the wild berries she found along the creek. "You'll eat better this winter than you have in years," she told Thomas one evening as they surveyed the well-stocked pantry. Thomas had to agree. For the first time since his mother's death, he felt confident that he wouldn't spend the cold months surviving on barely adequate food. Bertha May's skills in the kitchen had transformed not just his meals, but his entire sense of security about getting through the harsh Nebraska winter. Their neighbors had begun to take notice of the improvements around Thomas's farm. When Rebecca, his closest neighbor, stopped by one afternoon, she openly admired the neat organization of the barn, the healthy appearance of the livestock, and the obvious prosperity that seemed to have settled over the property. "You've done well for yourself, Thomas," Rebecca said, though she looked curiously at Bertha May as she spoke. "Your farm looks better than it has in years." Thomas felt a flash of pride, followed immediately by an uncomfortable realization. He had been accepting compliments for improvements that were mostly Bertha May's doing. She was the one who had reorganized the barn for better efficiency, treated the sick animals, and created the systems that were making everything run so smoothly. But when Rebecca and other neighbors complimented his farm's success, Thomas never mentioned Bertha May's contributions. He accepted the praise as if he had accomplished everything himself, and Bertha May never corrected him or claimed credit for her work. This pattern became more obvious when people from town started visiting. The pastor stopped by to check on Thomas's spiritual welfare and ended up staying for dinner. Bertha May's cooking was so impressive that the pastor asked for recipes to share with his wife. But when he complimented Thomas on finding such a capable housekeeper, Thomas felt his face burn with embarrassment. "She's not exactly a housekeeper," Thomas said awkwardly, not sure how to explain their arrangement. "Oh, I see," the pastor said with a knowing smile. "Well, she certainly seems like a treasure. You're fortunate to have found someone so skilled." Thomas realized that people were starting to make assumptions about his relationship with Bertha May, but he wasn't sure how to correct them without explaining the whole complicated story of Eleanor's death and Bertha May's unexpected arrival. The situation became more difficult when Thomas's cousin James arrived for an unannounced visit from back east. James was everything Thomas sometimes wished he could be: educated, well-dressed, sophisticated, and completely comfortable in social situations. He had come to Nebraska on business and decided to stop by to see how his country cousin was managing. Thomas was excited to show off his improved farm to someone from his family, but he also felt nervous about introducing Bertha May to James. His cousin represented the cultured world that Thomas had hoped to bring to his farm through marriage to Eleanor. Bertha May, despite all her valuable qualities, was nothing like the refined ladies James was used to meeting. When James arrived, Bertha May was outside working in the garden, her sleeves rolled up and her hands dirty from harvesting the last of the fall vegetables. Thomas felt ashamed of how she looked, practical and work-worn instead of ladylike and delicate. Bertha May, Thomas called out. Could you please come inside? I'd like you to meet my cousin James. But when Bertha May approached the house, Thomas felt a stab of panic. What would James think of this large, practical woman with her Irish accent and straightforward manner? How could Thomas explain why she was living in his house without making the whole situation sound improper or desperate? Actually, Thomas said quickly, maybe you could stay outside and finish the garden work? James and I have some family business to discuss. Bertha May stopped walking and looked at Thomas with a mixture of hurt and understanding. She had seen the well-dressed stranger and immediately grasped Thomas's embarrassment about introducing her. Of course, she said quietly. I'll be working in the barn if you need anything. Thomas spent the afternoon showing James around his farm, accepting compliments on the improvements while carefully avoiding any detailed explanation of how they had been accomplished. James was impressed by the obvious prosperity and organization, but Thomas felt sick every time he accepted praise for work that wasn't Bertha May's. When dinner time came, Thomas faced another dilemma. He couldn't very well hide Bertha May for the entire visit, but he also dreaded James's reaction to her. In the end, he asked Bertha May to prepare dinner, but suggested that maybe she could eat in the kitchen while he and James dined at the main table. I understand, Bertha May said, though Thomas could see the pain in her eyes. I'll make sure you both have a good meal. The dinner was perfect as always. Bertha May had prepared roast chicken with all the accompaniments, fresh bread, and even a pie made from preserved apples. James was thoroughly impressed with the quality of the food and the obvious skill required to prepare it. Your housekeeper is quite talented, James said. Where did you find someone with such excellent cooking skills out here in the middle of nowhere? Thomas mumbled something vague about good fortune and changed the subject. But throughout the meal, he was painfully aware of Bertha May moving quietly around the kitchen, cleaning up and preparing for the next day's meals. She had made their wonderful dinner possible, but Thomas was treating her like a servant instead of the partner she had become. After James left the next morning, the atmosphere between Thomas and Bertha May was strained and uncomfortable. She went about her usual work with quiet efficiency, but she didn't hum while she worked, and she avoided making conversation beyond what was necessary for coordinating their tasks. Thomas knew he had hurt her feelings, but he didn't know how to apologize, without acknowledging that he was ashamed of her. The truth was complicated. He wasn't ashamed of her skills or her character, but he was embarrassed by how different she was from the kind of wife he had always imagined having. Finally, 3 days after James's visit, Bertha May confronted him. Directly. I know I'm not what you wanted, she said as they sat by the fire after dinner. I know I'm not refined or educated or any of the things you hoped for in a wife, but I didn't think you were ashamed of me. Thomas felt his face burn with guilt. I'm not ashamed of you, he said, though even as he spoke the words he knew they weren't entirely true. Then why did you hide me from your cousin like I was something embarrassing? Why do you accept compliments for work I've done without ever mentioning my contributions? Thomas struggled to find an answer that wasn't hurtful but also wasn't dishonest. It's complicated, he said finally. I had certain expectations about how my life would go, about the kind of wife I would have. It's hard to adjust to something so different from what I planned. Bertha May nodded slowly. I understand that I wasn't part of your plans, but I thought we had become partners, maybe even friends. I thought you respected the work I do and the contributions I make to this farm. I do respect your work, Thomas said quickly. You've made this place better than it's ever been. I couldn't manage without you now. But you're still hoping for something different, Bertha May said sadly. You're still mourning the life you thought you would have with Eleanor. Thomas couldn't deny it. Even as he had grown to appreciate Bertha May's practical skills and reliable partnership, part of him was still dreaming of romantic love and refined companionship. He wanted both the security that Bertha May provided and the cultural sophistication that Eleanor had represented. I don't know if I can be what you're looking for, Bertha May said finally, but I thought I might be enough for what you actually need, Apparently I was wrong about that. The conversation ended there, but it left both of them with important questions to consider. Thomas had to decide whether he could accept the reality of what Bertha May offered instead of clinging to fantasies about what Eleanor might have provided. And Bertha May had to decide whether she could build a life with someone who saw her as valuable, but not quite valuable enough. December arrived with unusually dry conditions and strong winds that made everyone in Cedar Falls nervous. The grass had turned brown early and there had been almost no snow to dampen the prairie. Old-timers talked in worried voices about fire, weather, and mothers kept their children closer to home. The fire started 20 miles south of Cedar Falls on a Tuesday morning when a spark from a passing train ignited the dry grass beside the railroad tracks. The wind caught the flames and pushed them north across the prairie faster than a horse could run. By afternoon, a wall of orange fire stretched across the horizon, sending up black smoke that could be seen for 50 miles. Thomas was working in his barn when Rebecca rode up on her horse, her face grim with worry. "Prairie fire coming this way," she called out. "Maybe 6 hours before it reaches us, maybe less if the wind picks up. Everyone's gathering at the schoolhouse to organize the defense." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Prairie fires were every farmer's nightmare. The flames could destroy years of work in a matter of hours, burning crops, buildings, livestock, and sometimes people who couldn't get out of the way fast enough. He ran to the house to tell Bertha May, but she was already packing emergency supplies into a canvas bag. She had seen the smoke and understood what it meant as quickly as any longtime prairie resident. "We need to get the animals moved first," she said without preamble. "The cattle can be driven to the creek bottom where there's less grass to burn. The chickens and pigs will have to go in the root cellar." Thomas was amazed by how quickly she took charge of the situation. While he was still trying to process the danger they were facing, Bertha May was already implementing a survival plan. They worked together for the next hour, moving livestock to safer areas and soaking down the roof and walls of the cabin with creek water. Bertha May seemed to know exactly what needed to be done, directing their efforts with the calm efficiency of someone who had faced disasters before. When they reached the schoolhouse, they found the entire community gathered in a state of controlled panic. The men were organizing into firefighting crews, while the women prepared to evacuate children and elderly residents if the fire couldn't be stopped. Thomas joined the men's group, expecting Bertha May to go with the other women. Instead, she marched straight up to the fire chief, a grizzled old rancher named Bill Patterson, who had been fighting prairie fires for 30 years. "I've fought fires before," she announced, "in Ireland and in Pennsylvania. I know how to dig fire breaks and coordinate water brigades. Put me where you need me most." Patterson looked skeptical. "Ma'am, this is dangerous work. The womenfolk are organizing the evacuation plans." "The womenfolk can organize without me," Bertha May said firmly. "I'm more used to you digging fire breaks than I am packing picnic baskets for refugees." Several of the men exchanged glances. It was unusual for a woman to volunteer for the dangerous work of fighting fires, especially a woman who wasn't from their community. But Patterson was practical above all else, and he could see that Bertha May knew what she was talking about. "All right," he said finally. "You can work with the crew digging the fire break along Miller's Ridge, but you follow orders and you get out if things get too dangerous." Thomas felt a mixture of pride and worry as he watched Bertha May join the crew heading out to face the approaching fire. She was the only woman in the group, but she kept up with the men's pace and worked with the same focused determination that she brought to every task. The next 6 hours were the longest of Thomas's life. He worked with a different crew, digging fire breaks and setting backfires to create burned areas that the main fire couldn't cross. The work was backbreaking, dangerous, and terrifying. The wall of flames seemed to grow bigger and more threatening every time he looked up from his shovel, but it was Bertha May's crew that made the difference in saving Cedar Falls. Working along Miller's Ridge, they managed to create a fire break that diverted the main fire away from the town and the surrounding farms. Bertha May's experience with fire-fighting techniques proved invaluable, and she quickly became the unofficial second-in-command of her crew. Thomas heard about her contributions from other men who had witnessed her work. She had known exactly where to dig the most effective fire breaks, how to coordinate the water carriers for maximum efficiency, and when to take calculated risks that saved precious time. "That woman of yours is something special," Bill Patterson told Thomas as they watched the fire finally burn itself out against the creek bottom. "She worked harder than any two men and never complained once. You're lucky to have her." Thomas felt a strange mixture of emotions at Patterson's words. Pride in Bertha May's courage and competence, gratitude for her role in saving their community, and shame at how he had been treating her over the past few weeks, when the immediate danger was over and the crews began returning to town. Thomas looked for Bertha May among the soot-covered, exhausted firefighters. He found her helping to treat minor burns and injuries, using her knowledge of herbal remedies to ease people's pain. "How did you know so much about fighting fires?" Thomas asked when she finally had a moment to rest. "Experience," Bertha May said tiredly. "I lived through the big fire in Pittsburgh 5 years ago, learned what worked and what didn't. When you're poor, you end up in dangerous places and you learn to cope or you don't survive." Thomas looked at this woman he had been living with for 3 months and realized how little he really knew about her past. She had survived experiences that would have broken many people, and she had used that knowledge to help save their entire community over the next few days. As the community recovered from the fire threat, Thomas noticed how differently people treated Bertha May. The women who had initially been suspicious of this large, foreign stranger now sought her advice about practical matters. The men who had worked alongside her spoke of her with genuine respect and admiration. Rebecca, his neighbor, was particularly vocal in her praise. "I don't know what you were so worried about," she told Thomas. "That woman is worth her weight in gold. She's got more practical sense and courage than most men I know." Thomas began to see Bertha May through the community's eyes instead of through his own disappointed expectations. She wasn't the refined, educated wife he had dreamed of, but she was something perhaps more valuable, a strong, capable partner who could face any challenge alongside him. The fire had revealed not just Bertha May's courage and competence, but also Thomas's own shallow values. While he had been worried about what people would think of her appearance and manner, she had been quietly earning their respect through her actions and character. One evening, as they sat by their fire watching the sunset over the now blackened prairie, Thomas finally found the courage to speak honestly. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've been treating you badly, and I've been ashamed of the wrong things." Bertha May looked at him with tired but curious eyes. "What do you mean?" "I was ashamed that you weren't refined and educated like Eleanor. But I should have been ashamed of myself for not appreciating what you actually are. You saved this farm, probably saved my life, and definitely helped save our whole community. I've been a fool to think that any of that mattered less than piano playing and poetry." Bertha May was quiet for a long moment. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally. "But the question is whether you've really changed your mind or whether you're just grateful because of the fire. When life gets back to normal, will you be embarrassed by me again?" It was a fair question, and Thomas knew that his answer would determine their future together. He had to decide once and for all whether he could accept the reality of who Bertha May was instead of mourning the fantasy of who Eleanor might have been. Christmas came to Cedar Falls with a gentle snowfall that covered the blackened prairie with clean white drifts. Thomas and Bertha May had settled into a comfortable winter routine, working together to maintain the farm and prepare for spring planting. But the question Bertha May had asked after the fire still hung between them, unresolved and important. Thomas spent the long winter evenings thinking about what he really wanted from life and marriage. He watched Bertha May as she worked around the cabin, mending clothes with neat stitches, planning improvements for the next growing season, and cooking meals that filled their home with warmth and good smells. Slowly, he began to understand that he had been chasing an illusion while ignoring a remarkable reality. The real test of his changed feelings came in late January when a traveling salesman stopped at their farm, looking for a place to spend the night during a blizzard. Thomas and Bertha May offered him shelter. As was the custom among prairie folk during harsh weather, the salesman was a smooth-talking man from Chicago who considered himself sophisticated and worldly. During dinner he made several remarks about frontier women and their lack of refinement, clearly assuming that Bertha May was some kind of hired help rather than Thomas's partner. "You really should consider finding yourself a proper wife," the salesman told Thomas as Bertha May served them coffee. "A man in your position deserves better than making do with whatever rough help he can find out here." Thomas felt his temper flare at the insulting comment. 6 months ago, he might have been embarrassed by the salesman's assumptions. Tonight, he was angry on Bertha May's behalf. "You're mistaken about several things," Thomas said coldly. "First, Bertha May is my wife, not my hired help. Second, I couldn't ask for a better partner in any position. And third, I think you'll find more genuine class and character in this woman than in all the so-called refined ladies you've probably met in Chicago." The salesman looked surprised by Thomas's sharp response, but he quickly apologized and changed the subject. Bertha May said nothing, but Thomas caught her looking at him with something like wonder in her eyes. After the salesman left the next morning, Bertha May confronted Thomas about his defense of her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I, used to people making assumptions." "Well, I'm not used to letting people insult my wife," Thomas replied, then stopped short as he realized what he had said. They looked at each other for a long moment, both understanding that something important had just been acknowledged. Thomas had called her his wife, and he had meant it. "Is that what I am?" Bertha May asked quietly. "Your wife?" Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would shape both their futures. "That's what I'd like you to be if you're willing. Not because I need a housekeeper or a farmhand, but because I've come to love and respect the woman you actually are. Not because you've given up on finding someone better. Because I've realized that there isn't anyone better," Thomas said firmly. "I was in love with a fantasy, Bertha May. You're real and strong and everything I actually need in a partner. I've been a fool not to see it sooner." Bertha May studied his face, looking for signs that he was just settling for her because he had no other choice. But what she saw was genuine affection and respect, perhaps for the first time since she had arrived in Cedar Falls. "I love you too," she said simply. "I have for months, even when you were ashamed of me. But I need to know that you're choosing me, not just accepting me." "I'm choosing you," Thomas said without hesitation. If Eleanor had lived and arrived as planned, I think I would have been disappointed by how little she could contribute to our actual life together. "You're exactly the partner I need, even if it took me too long to realize it." That evening they sat by the fire planning their real wedding. They had been living as partners for months, but they wanted to make their commitment official in front of their community. Thomas wanted everyone to know that he was proud to call Bertha May his wife. The wedding took place on a sunny February morning in the Cedar Falls church. The same people who had whispered and stared when Bertha May first arrived now filled the pews to celebrate their union. Rebecca stood as matron of honor, and Bill Patterson served as Thomas's best man. The pastor, who had enjoyed many excellent dinners at their table, performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure. Bertha May wore the cream silk dress that Thomas had originally ordered for Eleanor, but which needed to be altered to fit her larger frame. Instead of looking wrong on her, the dress seemed to emphasize her natural dignity and strength. Thomas wore his store-bought suit, but this time he felt comfortable and confident instead of awkward. During the ceremony, Thomas looked out at the gathered community and felt proud instead of embarrassed. These people had seen Bertha May's courage during the fire, had benefited from her knowledge and skills, and had come to respect her as a valuable member of their community. Their approval meant more to him now than the opinions of sophisticated strangers ever could. In his vows, Thomas spoke honestly about his journey from disappointment to love, about learning to value substance over surface, and about his gratitude for finding a true partner. Bertha May's vows were characteristically direct and practical, promising to work alongside him through whatever challenges life might bring. After the ceremony, the community held a celebration dinner at the schoolhouse. Everyone brought food to share, and the evening was filled with music, dancing, and good wishes for the new couple. Thomas danced with his wife, no longer caring that she was larger and stronger than the delicate ladies in romantic novels. She was his match in every way that mattered. As they drove home under a sky full of winter stars, Thomas reflected on how much his understanding of love and marriage had changed. He had started the year looking for a fantasy companion who would make his life more pleasant. Instead, he had found a real partner who made his life more meaningful. "Are you happy?" Bertha May asked as they sat in their cabin, finally alone. "As husband and wife, happier than I ever thought possible," Thomas replied honestly. "I thought I knew what I wanted, but I was completely wrong. What I actually needed was someone who could face life's challenges alongside me, someone strong, enough to handle whatever comes our way." "Even if she's twice the size you expected?" Bertha May asked with a smile. "Especially because she's twice the size I expected," Thomas said, pulling her close. "It turns out that when life gets difficult, you want someone substantial by your side." They had started as strangers thrown together by circumstance and deception. But through shared work, mutual respect, and the gradual recognition of each other's true worth, they had built something much stronger than the romantic fantasy. Thomas had originally pursued Dot as spring approached and they began planning for their first full growing season as a married couple. Thomas knew that he had found something rare and valuable. Not the gentle, refined love he had imagined, but a deep partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of genuine affection that grows stronger through facing life's challenges together. Their love story had not begun with poetry and piano music, but it would endure through droughts and fires, hard work and simple pleasures, and all the real experiences that make a marriage truly successful. Thomas had learned that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as disappointments, and that true love is found not in fantasy, but in the courage to appreciate what is real and valuable right in front of you.